Stop complaining. You don't even help us. My mom snapped as I lay shivering with fever on the couch. She spent my grocery money on my sister's spa day. This is my house, get out, I said. That night, I cut all ties and left their bags outside. I, 28M, never thought I'd be the type to kick my own family out. But sometimes people push you past your breaking point. The fever hit me like a freight train on a Tuesday morning. My body ached, my head pounded, and every breath felt like swallowing glass. I'd been supporting my mom and sister financially for 2 years since Dad passed, letting them live in the house I inherited from him. They moved in temporarily after losing their apartment, but temporary had stretched into permanent without any discussion. I dragged myself to the couch, wrapped in every blanket I could find, shivering despite the 75-degree weather outside. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister asking if I could pick up some groceries since she was running low on her favorite snacks. I managed to type back that I was sick and asked if she could handle it this time. 20 minutes later, Mom stormed into the living room. She looked at me sprawled on the couch and immediately launched into her usual lecture about how I never helped around the house. I tried to explain that I was burning up with fever, but she waved me off dismissively. She told me to stop being dramatic and reminded me that she'd raised me better than to be so lazy. That's when she dropped the bomb. She'd taken the grocery money I'd left on the kitchen counter, my last $100 until payday, and spent it on a spa day for my sister. Apparently, my sister had been stressed about her upcoming job interview and needed to relax. Mom explained this like it was the most reasonable thing in the world, as if my fever and empty fridge were minor inconveniences compared to my sister's stress. I stared at her in disbelief. The grocery money wasn't just for snacks. It was for actual food, medicine, and basic necessities. I hadn't eaten anything substantial in 2 days because I'd been too sick to cook, and now there was nothing left to even order delivery. When I pointed this out, Mom's expression hardened. She told me to stop complaining because I didn't even help them anyway. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was literally paying for their housing, utilities, and most of their expenses while working 50-hour weeks at a job that barely covered everything. My sister appeared in the doorway, fresh from her spa day, with perfectly manicured nails and glowing skin. She chimed in, agreeing with Mom that I was being selfish. She reminded me that family was supposed to support each other, conveniently forgetting that the support had been flowing in only one direction for months. The conversation escalated quickly. Mom started listing all the ways I'd disappointed her over the years, bringing up childhood mistakes and failed relationships like they were relevant to the current situation. My sister added her own commentary about how I'd never been there for her when she needed emotional support, which was rich considering I'd been there financially every single time. Something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the fever making me delirious, or maybe it was 2 years of accumulated resentment finally boiling over. I looked at both of them standing there, healthy and pampered, criticizing me while I could barely keep my eyes open. I told them this was my house. The words came out quieter than I intended, but they carried weight. Mom laughed and said I was being ridiculous. That family didn't kick family out over money. She reminded me that Dad would be ashamed of how I was treating them. That crossed a line. Dad had worked his entire life to pay off this house, and he'd left it to me specifically because he knew I'd take care of it. He'd also left me with the responsibility of looking after Mom, but I don't think he intended for that to mean becoming their personal ATM while being treated like garbage. I repeated myself, louder this time. This was my house, and they needed to get out. The room went silent except for the sound of my labored breathing. Mom's face went through several emotions: shock, anger, then something that looked almost like fear. My sister tried to backtrack, suddenly concerned about my fever and offering to make me soup. But it was too late. The damage was done, and my decision was made. I gave them until the end of the week to find somewhere else to go. The next few days were tense. They alternated between trying to guilt me into changing my mind and acting like nothing had happened. Mom would make comments about how cruel I was being, while my sister would leave passive-aggressive notes around the house about family loyalty. I used those days to recover from my fever and think clearly about the situation. I realized this wasn't just about the grocery money or the spa day. It was about years of taking advantage of my generosity while showing no appreciation or respect. It was about being treated like a servant in my own home while supporting 2 able-bodied adults who could work but chose not to. By Friday, They still hadn't made any effort to look for a new place. They seemed convinced I'd cave and let them stay. That evening, while they were out having dinner at a restaurant they somehow had money for, I packed their belongings into suitcases and garbage bags. When they returned home, their bags were sitting on the front porch. I'd changed the locks that afternoon. Mom pounded on the door, demanding to be let in and threatening to call the police. I reminded her through the door that I'd given them a week's notice, which was more than legally required for house guests. My sister tried a different approach, crying and apologizing through the window. She promised they'd pay me back and help more around the house. But her promises felt empty after months of similar commitments that never materialized. The police did show up, called by my mother. The officer listened to both sides and confirmed that since they weren't tenants with a lease, I had every right to ask them to leave my property. He suggested they contact local shelters or family members for temporary housing. Update 1. It's been 3 weeks since that night, and the silence has been both peaceful and unsettling. My phone buzzed constantly for the first few days with calls and texts from both of them, ranging from angry accusations to tearful apologies. I blocked their numbers after Mom left a voicemail calling me every name in the book and threatening to contest Dad's will. Extended family members started reaching out, having heard their version of events. Most of the calls followed the same pattern. Initial shock that I'd kicked out my own mother, followed by lectures about family obligations and forgiveness. I explained my side to a few relatives, but quickly realized that Mom and my sister had painted themselves as victims of my sudden, unprovoked cruelty. My aunt called me heartless. My cousin suggested I needed therapy to deal with my anger issues. Even my grandmother, who'd always been supportive, seemed disappointed in me. The family narrative was clear. I was the ungrateful son who'd abandoned his struggling mother and sister over a minor disagreement. But something interesting happened during those conversations. When I mentioned specific details, like supporting them financially for 2 years, or them spending my grocery money while I was sick, the tone would shift slightly. People would get quieter, ask fewer questions, and end the calls more abruptly. I started documenting everything I could remember. Bank statements showing the money I'd transferred to them monthly. Receipts for groceries, utilities, and household items I'd purchased. Text messages I'd saved where they'd asked for money or made demands. The evidence painted a clear picture of financial abuse that had been building for months. My sister showed up at my workplace last Tuesday. She looked rough, tired, stressed, and wearing the same clothes I'd seen her in days earlier. She waited by my car in the parking lot, and when I approached, she immediately started crying. She told me they'd been staying with different relatives, moving every few days when their welcome wore out. Mom was furious and refused to look for work, insisting this was all temporary until I came to my senses. My sister had applied for a few jobs, but hadn't heard back yet. She begged me to let them come back, promising things would be different. She swore they'd contribute financially and help with household responsibilities. She even offered to pay me back the spa money, though she admitted she didn't currently have it. I listened to her entire speech without interrupting. When she finished, I told her I appreciated the apology, but my decision was final. I explained that this wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about self-respect and setting boundaries that should have been established long ago. She asked if I really intended to let my own mother become homeless. I reminded her that Mom was a capable adult who'd chosen to spend money on luxuries instead of contributing to basic household expenses. I also pointed out that there were resources available for people in genuine need, but pride was preventing them from accessing help. Update 2. Last week brought an unexpected development. My sister got a job at a local retail store, nothing glamorous, but steady work with benefits. She called to tell me the news, and for the first time in months, she sounded genuinely hopeful rather than entitled. She'd found a small apartment she could afford with her new income, and she was planning to move in at the end of the month. She thanked me for forcing her to become independent, though she admitted she'd hated me for it initially. She said the experience had taught her skills she'd never needed to develop while living off my support. Mom, however, was a different story. According to my sister, she'd become increasingly bitter and was blaming everyone except herself for the situation. She'd burned bridges with several relatives by overstaying her welcome and making unreasonable demands. She was currently staying with my uncle, but that arrangement was also becoming strained. My sister asked if I'd consider having a conversation with Mom, not about moving back in, but about rebuilding some kind of relationship. She thought Mom might be more receptive now that reality had set in. I told her I'd think about it, but honestly, I wasn't sure I was ready for that conversation. The house felt different now, quieter, but also more peaceful. I could leave money on the counter without worrying it would disappear. I could buy groceries and know they'd still be there when I got home from work. I could be sick without being criticized for not doing enough. I'd started sleeping better, eating regular meals, and even had energy for hobbies I'd abandoned during the chaos of supporting 3 adults on one income. Friends I'd lost touch with were commenting on how much happier I seemed. The financial pressure was gone, and I was actually able to save money for the first time in years. But the family situation weighed on me. I'd grown up believing that family came first, no matter what. Dad had always emphasized loyalty and taking care of each other. Part of me wondered if I'd failed to live up to those values, if there had been another way to handle things that wouldn't have resulted in such complete separation. Update 3. 2 months after that night, I finally agreed to meet Mom for coffee. My sister had been working on both of us, playing mediator and insisting we needed to talk. I chose a public place and set clear boundaries about what I would and wouldn't discuss. Mom looked older, more tired than I remembered. She'd been staying with my uncle for 6 weeks, and the stress was showing. She started the conversation with an apology, which surprised me. She admitted she'd taken advantage of my generosity and hadn't appreciated how much I'd been doing for them. But the apology came with conditions and justifications. She explained that losing Dad had been devastating, that she'd felt lost and overwhelmed. She said she'd relied on me because I was the only stable thing in her life, and she hadn't realized how much pressure she was putting on me. I acknowledged her grief and the difficulty of her situation, but I also explained how her actions had affected me. I told her about working extra hours to cover their expenses, about skipping meals so there would be enough food for everyone, about the stress of being criticized while providing everything they needed. She seemed genuinely surprised by some of what I shared. In her mind, I was the successful son with a good job and a house, so supporting them shouldn't have been a burden. She hadn't considered that my income had limits, or that I had my own financial goals and needs. The conversation was difficult but necessary. We didn't resolve everything, and I made it clear that moving back in wasn't an option. But we established a foundation for rebuilding our relationship on more equal terms. Mom eventually found a job through a temp agency and moved into a small studio apartment. It wasn't the comfortable lifestyle she'd enjoyed at my house, but it was hers. She started taking pride in her independence, something she hadn't felt since Dad died. My sister and I maintained regular contact, and our relationship actually improved once the financial dynamic was removed. She'd learned to budget, cook, and handle adult responsibilities she'd avoided for years. She admitted that being forced out had been the push she needed to grow up. The extended family drama eventually died down as people moved on to other gossip. Some relatives never fully understood my decision, but others quietly admitted they'd dealt with similar situations with their own family members. Looking back, I don't regret my choice. That night when I put their bags on the porch wasn't about revenge, it was about survival. I'd reached a point where continuing the same pattern would have destroyed my health, finances, and self-respect. The fever had been a catalyst, but the real sickness was the toxic dynamic that had developed in my home. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for people is refuse to enable their dysfunction, even when they hate you for it. Dad would have understood. He'd worked hard his entire life and expected others to do the same. He'd taught me to be generous, but not foolish, to help family, but not at the expense of my own well-being. I think he'd be proud that I finally learned to set boundaries and stick to them. The house is still quiet, but it's a good quiet now. It's the sound of peace, independence, and self-respect. And that's worth more than any family approval I might have lost along the way.